Welcome to the live stream, ladies and gentlemen. We're not going to do the splash screen today. We're just going to go right in. Hello, I'm your host today, Bumpy McSquigums. I am joined by a tiny disaster and Cupogoodness, who's a slightly larger disaster. And we're beginning our talk on learning from game post-mortems. So, how's it going, folks?
Going. How about you?
Pretty good. Doing all right.
It's hot. It's hot here this week, and so that's why I am dressed down a little bit. It is got to keep we got AC, but it's been running pretty much all the time, so we got to keep it under wraps to some degree. Can't be running all the time. Ooh, okay.
Yes, you can.
I'm good.
That's the way. You've never been to Florida.
I
24/7
know.
AC.
I know. Oh no, I know. I don't have sunbrain though. I don't think yet, so we're good to go. I'm not off the rocker just yet. So this is an interesting topic. Postmortems. What we're talking about here, for those who don't know, postmortems are usually write-ups or breakdowns, analyses, debriefings of what you've pulled from the experience you just got through as through the game development process. So after a product is released or a game is released, you take that time, usually several weeks, if not even months after the release. That's like the kind of the sweet spot for the writing up of the postmortem. And I think that matters because of the postmortem matters because of perspective, right? Um, when we talked about last week, pivots in game design, which means that you are making really difficult decisions in the chaos of or at least the rigmarole of having to continually spend money to make a game, right? And you're in it. It's very involved. The design process, like all the teams or all the staff members on the team doing what they're doing, very active. Communication is all over the place in a good way, because you have to be just like an octopus, so to speak, working together with all your limbs. And that's so when you make those decisions within the pivots within that's all well and good, but it's almost certainly never going to be as clear of a perspective as when you have hindsight. So that's why the postmortem, I think, is really important, because it's like, okay, this thing is officially done. We're not working on it anymore. We don't have those kind, like we'll talk about certain kinds of bias, but we don't have that bias of being involved in the project at the time. Like we also are able to see sales data. We're also able to see like the results of the work and how things have gone. So we can not only talk about some of the challenges, or like the challenges that we feel like in the game design can be confirmed or maybe denied or something by the sales data, if that makes sense. Because you might not really think of them as challenges until you see the struggles with the sales. You see where the Steam reviews are sort of pointing out the flaws, and then you, in retrospect, with those new perspectives, you go back and say, you know what, we did struggle on this front, or we didn't have a plan for this, and it didn't work out, and we had to improve upon that. Unlike anything else, I think that postmortems are like really prevalent in game design versus like other mediums with entertainment mediums, because it's really, really, really hard to get a game right, as we talked about, and it's a thing that is still in its kind of adolescence. Like, people are still learning, and there's always new engines coming out. There's always new technology coming out. So it's like it's always kind of like people are having to kind of learn on the go. Often, jury rigging situations or designing their own customs or additions to the current engines they're using, or like what their programming bedrock looks like, all that kind of stuff. So it's a thing that's we talk about this a lot. We try to stay on the surface as much as possible, because in truth, it's a very complicated process to make a game. And so when you have that very complex process, not even talking about just the programmer's job, just like the whole communication group efforts, bringing things together into one functioning digital interactive digital thing, like that just takes so much effort and so much kind of just gumption, headspace, all that kind of stuff. Everything you've got, basically, you're putting into that. And by the end of it, it still might not. It might be just a mediocre result. It might be a mediocre, just finished product, kind of thing. And that's okay to some extent. You have to kind of be open to the idea of, okay, we've not gotten this exactly right. We've learned about this in hindsight, and so here's sort of where we can go from here with this. We always talk about like how you could fix your current game, but that's in a lot of realities, that's not going to be reasonable for people, right? It's more reasonable that they're going to think they have a good game, they're going to release it. It's going to turn out that it has some design flaws or it has some issues with player experience, and then you learn from that and you bring that into your next go round. I think that's way more common than people just finding every perfect pivot in a game design, process, and then finding their way to, glory. I mean, I'm sure that happens. I'm just saying it doesn't happen often or all the time. And it's more likely that we're going to have to put something out there and learn from that experience, right? That's a very normal thing in life. Like, put ourselves out there, gain experience. Maybe it's not a perfect situation, but we still gained experience for the next time around. We can improve upon ourselves. So that's kind of the thing with the post-mortem. Those are my initial thoughts, I think, anyway. And there's a lot to glean from them. And there's also a lot to consider when taking them in, because they're not always going to be advice that's sound for you. You have to take certain ones with grains of salt, and other thing, other just considerations as you go through them.
Missy says, "Evening, lovely people. I look forward to hearing about post-mortems. How do you make those in real life? I only know them from games like Game Developer Tycoon, and there they are automated, which is interesting. And then inquiring minds need to know what happened to the bed / futon."
So, futon's broken right now, and we're seeing if we can fix it, but it might just be kaput. So we'll see. It's off of its frame on the wood frame area and stuff. It's just not working right now. So we tried.
I told you to stop suplexing onto the futon. You didn't listen.
Yeah. I suplexed my children onto it too many times, and then it just I could feel that last time. I was like, either my son broke or the futon broke, and it was the futon, so it was good. No, I'm joking. It wasn't anything like that. We're good to go. But yeah, it's been a iffy futon since we got it. I'll say that. And it was just sort of an extra
when thing. I saw it, my brain went, "Oh, we finally dealt with the laundry that we all pretend definitely isn't there every week, or whatever it is you're hiding under the blanket."
100%. 100%. I don't even try to not pretend anymore. If anybody wants to talk to me about how family of four has an endless pile of clean laundry, I can go into it. It's an insane thing. I don't like it. I mean, I know it's my family of four, not everybody's family of four, but mine has that problem.
No, so anyway, I was like, "Oh wow, we dealt with the laundry. That is amazing."
There's certainly not a bunch of clean clothes smashed underneath the mattress over there. I can promise you that. So, and I'm not lying at all. And just believe me, please believe me. Okay, back into
100%.
Back into the post-mortems talk. So, Tiny Disaster, you were able to kind of put some.
Missy's question is kind of worth addressing first, though. How do you go about actually writing one of? Is it something your team is going to have a chat about? Is there kind of the project managers looking at it? Who's making these did we succeed or fail calls?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it comes from anybody who wants to do it. It's a practice, right? I don't think it's a thing that is not necessarily something that you have in the contract for someone to do or anything like that. It's not something like contractually you're expecting someone to do. Maybe you are. Maybe in the early going you ask in your contracts, you're like, I at the end of the release, I want the programmer to give a postmortem about his experience on his or her experience or their experience on their area. Like, you don't ask them or their area and then in general, because you obviously want to get the perspective on on the project in general, but you also know they're going to have the best perspective on, or at least a unique perspective, of course, because they were the ones who did the job that they're giving their postmortem on. So
we're all still waiting for the postmortem on Chef Squad. We want to know what the final result of all that was. So we're gonna get that at some point.
Well, it's like a thing where you're working with another company and you can't really share some of the details of that thing because the publisher that we're working with right now is still kind of
down the line.
getting their stuff together to be able to make all the announcements, and so to speak. You know what I mean? Like it's out of our hands, but they are without throwing anybody under the bus. They're kind of dragging their feet a little bit in terms of getting things in a place where we can talk more about things. You know what I mean? So,
All ducks in a
but
row. It's fine.
yeah, the postmortems that okay. So what I think about how you would make it or what you would do is just you think about a couple of things. Like I think you have like three pillars in my mind, and maybe there's more, but this is what I think about when I heard, what do you think about when you write, or how do you write up a postmortem? So you start with whether or not I mean, it depends on if you're a positive or negative person. You want to do bad news or good news first. You start with what works potentially, what worked well. Looking back and seeing, okay, these are the things that we expected to work well and did. These are things that we didn't know was going to work well and did, and kind of go over that. You're basically, this is an analysis, right? Like this is a critical analysis, often of self and of your project, right? So it's important to go back and see the good and the positives, because those are things that you can say. Generally speaking, we can take some of these things and reliably, move forward with them into our next game. Obviously, not everything, because of different game design choices and genres and all that kind of stuff. But that's a great place to start. And then, of course, you move to the bad news. What didn't work? What was challenging? What ultimately came out of the woodwork at the end, and it just wasn't something that the players enjoyed. And you found that you thought one way about it and the players thought another way, and it ended up like the player's opinion matters the most in this case, because of course that relates to your sales. So those things, in a commercial release, you are really taking that in and saying, okay, here's where we apparently got it wrong. Whether you agree or not, you have to kind of just see the writing on the wall sometimes, right? And I'm not saying facts is facts, but I'm not saying the players always know what's best for the game or anything like that. But if you have patterns, if you have like mixed reviews for the same A, B, and C's that are being brought up, then you need to take that into consideration. And that's a big part of the postmortem. I'd say like that's like your major chunk, is really dissecting that and saying, not only identifying those things, but then saying, like, why did we get it wrong? How did we get it wrong? And what could we? And then this is the third pillar. What can we have done next time, or what can we do next time to improve upon the situation? It doesn't mean just be better at your design. It could just be like, we need to communicate more with, as we always talk about, Bumpy and TD. We need to communicate more with players in the early going of our design process, as opposed to later on, where the game is already set in stone and we're going to release it 1.0, that kind of thing, and then we just start getting testers, and we find out that that's way too late to get a lot of some of these interesting perspectives that could have affected the design early on in a really positive way. So I think that's the main thing, is you think about what you did right, what you did wrong, where and then like the unknown struggles, like the struggles that you didn't anticipate, the victories or the triumphs that you didn't anticipate, and kind of like wrap up with determining what that means to you as an individual or as a studio, depending on your perspective and who's writing it, right? And what that means for you or your studio going forward. It's easy to put things in that A, B, success, fail category, but I don't think that necessarily has to apply here all the time. Yes, you want to see if it was a financial success or not, and you want to be open to admitting that it's not. But this is a learning exercise for the most part, and you really should be trying to see the things that you can take forward and move forward with, because this is a long game that we're playing a lot of times, or at least that's how I think about it. And you don't see individual failures as complete disasters necessarily, unless it really, I guess, is that way. So yeah, it's a thing where one second, and then I have one last thought, and I'll give it to you two for the floor. But I feel like you should at least do this privately or internally, and you should at least do it as a debriefing, maybe in a meeting, like set up a debriefing meeting with your team or with the other person that worked with you on the game, or I guess just do a recording of yourself if it's just you. Sit there and record yourself just talking it out, if you don't feel like writing it out, because I've heard some, we've heard that, writing a postmortem is not just something that happens. It takes effort, and a lot of times it's effort after a major effort, right? Like releasing a full product was a lot of heavy lifting, and now people ask to do a postmortem. That's why a lot of times I think, in addition to, it makes sense to let the sales data come in and let the release kind of breathe. Because of course, if you wrote a postmortem in the first week, that doesn't make any sense. You're not going to have the full perspective of how the sales actually went and how the long tail is going and that kind of thing. So you don't have you lack information, so to speak. But I also think
you lack the perspective as well of
right.
You're still in it. You're still banking all your hopes and dreams on this game.
Correct. You want to disengage before you do the postmortem. That's a great point. Like, you want to be able to really be disengaged from the product in a way that you cannot be disengaged from the product in that initial launch window. And oftentimes you'll see it's in months later. And I think it's that. Plus, I think developers are just tired and not looking to do that right away. So you have that combination of things where you don't want it to be years down the road. But normally it's going to be months and months. Probably stressed with new bugs. Yes, definitely, Missy. Like, they're working on the post-launch. There's often things going on with that as well. And those kind of post-launch bugs you want to be discussing that in the post-mortem, right? So you can't rush it. Like, it has to be something where you feel like the game and its sort of hype around it and the sales and all that have sort of come to a calm, if that makes sense. Like, it's really come to not a standstill, but there's a stillness to it suddenly as it slowly kind of proceeds into its long tail. And maybe you as a studio or as an individual designer, developer, whatever, you're moving on to your next works. But before you do that, it's time to kind of put a bookend on this last one. And again, it really should be done internally. But what's great about game development and game designers is that it's often publicly shared. It is written out and then publicly posted, online to allow other developers and interested parties to read those and glean information from them. It is often a super humbling experience to do a postmortem. We know how limited successes can be in this day and age as far as financially successful. So a lot of these developers, I have a lot of respect for them because they have a lot of courage and selflessness in putting these things out publicly, because a lot of times they're not the prettiest things to read. They're often tough, often sad, often seemingly like the developer is in maybe a worse situation financially than they were before. And so, but that doesn't mean that they don't have their own path moving forward. And it also doesn't mean that they don't have good information to share, even if things didn't work out for them. I think that's really important to keep in mind. A lot of people flock to postmortems of successful games. It's a natural kind of thing, right? Like, if you're a developer or designer in roguelike, and like a roguelike designer, and you see this really popular roguelike have a postmortem come out, and you go, oh my gosh, I'm going to do all the things that they did. Well, there's, kind of that bias of success that's going to come into that postmortem for those writers. It's not saying that they're going to write a poor postmortem for you, but it's that the things that worked for them because they were them, because their game was their game. It just may not apply to you in that way. And that's something that I think TD was kind of talking about in her notes, in her pre-show notes, was that you really have to understand that these aren't magic bullets, these postmortems. Like, they don't have information that you could just, swipe up and say, okay, great, I have a handful of, really influential, significant ideas to move forward with. And now
I was able to follow this formula, and I will also have a hit. Is not remotely how it's going to work.
Correct. Yep. And so, yeah, I mean, it's something to think about, not within a vacuum, but understanding that it's their process that they went through, and they got those results from, again, everything that was happening with them. It has nothing to do with you necessarily, so you have to keep that in mind. That said, there might be little things that you go, oh man, that's a great idea. It doesn't necessarily work apples to apples for us, But is there some sort of hybrid or evolution of that idea that we can come up with and tie it to our game? Logically, this would sometimes be tied to, oh, look, they got a bunch of wish lists doing this kind of thing, or they got a bunch of email signups with this approach. Like, is there a way that we can do a similar kind of thing and get the similar kind of results? So that's something that a lot of times we pull from Post-Mortems. Of course, that's on like the marketing and business side. Like, we shared that, or we haven't shared it yet, but we have that top 10, that article that talks about the seminal Post-Mortems that have been released by game developers. These are all like AAA or AA games for the most part. There was like one or two indies, I think, in there, but mostly they were bigger games. Games like Thief, games like there was
Age of Empires 2.
Age of Empires 2, yeah. I don't have the article up. I need to get it up, obviously. But like there were several big name games that a lot of us have heard of, if not played.
Do we ever see those anymore? Because I thought that was interesting. Of like, yeah, lots of big games who I wouldn't imagine developers, like publishers, usually share a lot of behind the scenes information. But they were older big games, and like the Post-Mortems were published when they came out and whatnot. But I don't feel like I've seen a ton from bigger studios more recently. It feels a little more hush hush now than.
Yeah, I can agree. I'll agree with that. I'll also say that a lot of those people that were doing the Post-Mortems in those games are now indie developers, right? Like, so those guys that were like huge back then, like or developing these huge games, have gone independent themselves and run their own studios. So they were always kind of that indie mindset. Some of these guys, like the Thief, I really think Thief and some of these other developers, Age of Empires, those kind of things, they come from that analytical mindset where they were going to do that anyway. They didn't necessarily have that. It wasn't like you said. It was a sign of the times that they didn't have publishers down their throats about keeping secrets, all that kind of stuff. It's probably because of the competitive market right now. But I mean, it's tough because a lot of the writing's on the wall. It's not like there's like that many secrets out there. People create new things. Like, it's like, oh wow, you found something new. You've discovered a new way to get customers down the sales funnel, so to speak. But then everybody discovers it one way or the other. It's not like you can hide that thing because it's obvious. It's out there. It's in the wild usually. So it's weird that people that bigger, I guess, game developers don't do that. But I also think that, like you said, they're not the ones in charge a lot of times in that situation. Whereas indie studios, like there are publishers. Obviously, we talked about all those situations, the hybrid situations that come about now with indie developers and publishers. But even then, it's really up to the indie developer if they're going to do a Post-Mortem or not. There's no one usually looking over them that's like, we'd have to approve this through this situation, or actually we're not going to. We really don't want you to do that or share this information. Or you can do a Post-Mortem, but we're going to snip it to pieces in terms of what you can actually share versus what you want to share. So I think that's probably a thing that's happening more. Now, NDAs are crazy nowadays versus the old days. Non-disclosure agreements are signed at basically every turn for any major corporation or like company that doesn't want any leaks or anything like that about certain things. I don't deal with it that much, but when I do, it gets real serious. So it's a thing where I understand I feel like that kind of culture really pervades lately in the higher ranks, and so the hush hush thing is definitely a thing. I think that you also have folks like, I don't know, I don't want to praise anybody in particular because there's some ups and downs, but it feels like lately Microsoft has been really open with sharing their stuff, like on the Xbox side, and I don't think that they're sharing everything. I don't think that they're being like crazy open, but it's weird that a platform is just kind of open, like a platform like that is even open to begin with, and usually they're super closed. Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony have always been very close to the chest on things. So it's weird when you see like breakdowns of either data or what Microsoft is getting into in terms of, like we talked about, the accessibility. I mean, obviously it's good PR for them to do that. So it makes sense for them to put themselves out there and be like, here are the things that we're working on with accessibility. We're really going to like open up the building, so the chocolate factory, so to speak, for you to see what we're working on, and not just keep that at you guys, everybody at an arm's reach. And so it's interesting how that happens sometimes, but it's very much in pockets. And again, it's against the norm, but it's not against the norm for indies. I think you can find, you know, these postmortems coming out all the time. But I will say this, because of the current world we live in, it's less about full articles. People are probably doing Twitter threads. People are probably doing videos or TikToks or other things like that, doing those breakdowns. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, because that may be rushing the process a little bit. Twitter threads, probably okay, because you can write it out and then you're just dividing it up. I know that you can automate that process, right? Like you can just get like something where it automates the chop up. So you could write a full postmortem, I guess, and do that way. But let's see. Why is my camera doing this again? Did OBS update? Oh, sorry. So yeah, it's definitely because everybody's so busy. Like it's not like you're seeing, for how many indie games release, you're not seeing like a gluttony of postmortems, right? Like it's still kind of the same as it used to be. And I still think more people I didn't quite get this to this point, but it's a good point to mention. If your game's successful, it's more likely to get a postmortem than if your game's not successful, if that makes sense. Like, what I mean is that, like, on average, more people will write about their games and do a postmortem if they succeed or find success to some degree.
Well, when you're talking about places to find them, I was going to say you can find a decent amount on like game dev subreddits, which I find interesting because there's more room for Q&A and just asking and follow-up questions, all of that. But it does tend to be, like as I was looking through getting ready for this chat, of just like, here's this game I made that made nothing. Any idea why?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of those.
Yeah, that could be the end game for a lot of those. And I mean, that's going to be the situation. It points to how the realities of the situation, right? Like in that, I thought I put my best foot forward, and it turns out that I couldn't garner any interest, any sales at all, that kind of stuff. And that happens a lot. So, you kind of start there. Gama Sutra is now game developer, I think, or something like that. We talked about that before. But they have had the biggest repository of postmortems, both in written form and in like the GDC presentation, like Vault, that you can see. I think a lot of those are available on YouTube, and those are great to watch too. A lot of the talks that you see at GDC are basically postmortems, or maybe a specific through line from a postmortem that they want to focus on more. You'll see a lot of those kind of talks, like like they'll talk about specifics from the postmortem breakdown. So, yeah, I mean it's nice to be in the indie sphere because everybody wants to learn for the most part. Like that's like a general sentiment, and everybody wants to share their experiences for the most part because it allows others to glean that information and learn. But I also think that is sort of I say everyone, but it's not everyone, right? It's like, but there's that notion, which is cool. It's cool that notion exists, because I've worked in other, I haven't worked in too many other businesses because I only worked in outside of games until I was like 24, 23. But when I did, it wasn't open at all. Like other companies didn't. If companies talk to other companies, it was like one person and another person, like at a social event or in a bar or something like that. But it was never like actually being willing to like swap information either publicly or even just internally with each other. So it's definitely a sign of the times that things are too busy right now, because back in the day, people took more time with the breakdowns. Maybe developers are just having to churn the next product out. Maybe they never stopped developing the first game, which is a lot what we see a lot of times now, right?
Yeah.
Like post launch release, updates, and if they're making sales on that game and they don't want to see the drop off, then they just keep making content for it, and then maybe a postmortem doesn't ever make sense until that's done. It does make sense maybe at like a 1.0 postmortem. But like we talked about earlier, they're still going to be kind of connected to it. Like they're not really going to be disengaged from the project at that point, even a year down the road of the initial release. So it's muddled now, right? Like the idea of when to post mortem is probably muddled for a lot of games now because of the way games work in 2022, and over the last like 5 years.
So where did we leave off on?
I'm bringing your notes up now. Yeah, we should post that. Let's see some of those links that we have, and I'll get those in the restream here momentarily.
So this is kind of my last point, but jumping into it now about how the game industry definitely changes over time. Like reading some of these, like I remember playing Black and White as a kid. So reading the postmortem, and like some of the postmortems get into like, oh, well, we used this renderer or something went wrong with this engine, and like that kind of stuff does not stay relevant. But anything relating to like what makes a good game has stayed the same from beginning to end, and in a lot of ways isn't going to change. Like what's popular will change, but focusing in on your gameplay loop and finding ways to get feedback in terms of what a player is actually enjoying, those kind of things. Like it can feel counterintuitive to read older information at all. Oh, well, the technology changes so quickly. Is something from 2 years ago even relevant? But when it comes to that kind of stuff, it's so relevant versus writing about the technology you used is going to be helpful for a year or so versus.
Yeah, there's obviously going to be some things that don't age well from those postmortems because of the focus on just the tech at the time and things have changed and stuff. But I think it's a great point. I also think I had something there that oh man I was going to say that the business and marketing tips sometimes can be antiquated, but as we know, some business and marketing like structures have been in place for like thousands of years, and they work for a reason, right? And so you can glean that as well, like when you see certain approaches to how they marketed the game, how it sold, what they were doing around launch. That kind of stuff can often translate, even if it was 10, 15 years ago when they were doing it. Some of it won't. You'll be like, what the heck was that? Like social media, like that, like what's Dig, that kind of stuff. So like, I remember Dig. So yeah, things like that, like, they might mention and makes no sense, but there's certain things that you could certainly take. And I think that's the point, right? Like some of these are evergreen, not fully 100%, but there's some really good nuggets at least that you can always go back and look at and say, this is helping me kind of center myself, bracket what I want to do for my game design or for my development process, marketing, business release, all that kind of stuff.
So the way I view postmortems and the way I think most people should consider it, or maybe a definition of it, is it's obviously kind of a retrospective. People are looking back at their experience with it and they're sharing it. And in that case, in those cases, and again, this kind of goes with some of the things going to be antiquated and some of the things are going to stay true, and that is it's almost a history of game development through the eyes of the people who actually develop the game. And then from that point, I also wanted to say, and we kind of, you guys kind of danced around it and touched on it a bunch, but I think there's 2 or 3 different types of postmortems. You have the people who go immediately after the game launched, and whether it's successful or it's not, they're super invested in their game. They're very emotional, and they just go and bam, just blurt out whatever's on their mind. They don't think it through, and there's those you kind of have to take with a grain of salt because, again, they're very emotionally invested. It's their baby. They let it out into the world, and whether sink or swim, they're too close to it at that point. And then later on down the line, you have the folks who, let it breathe, get separated from it in at least some context, and they can think about it more objectively and rational, and then they can think about what worked, what didn't work, and so on and so forth. So you kind of have those 2 camps of various different people. And then you have the people who still, then you kind of have a split on people there. You have people who are willing to be like, all right, well, we tried this, it didn't work. We tried this, it didn't work. And then people are like, I put out a great game, everybody else is to blame, and they just blame everyone. So you're going to get all sorts of different types of postmortems. There's usually something to glean from every one of them. And it just kind of have to sift through it a little bit.
It's a great point. If you see bitterness lying in a postmortem, it's like maybe this hasn't had a chance to you haven't had a chance to digest this long enough. Because the 2 things that I think about is when based off what you just said right there, is that if you still have hope for something or if you still have dread for something with the game, then it's not time to do the postmortem yet. Like, it's once you have neither of those feelings for the game, then it's time to do the post. It's like I hope for this, or I fear that this. No, those things have to kind of be like, again, if you're right up next to the launch, the things you're saying are going to be based on those hopes and fears. It's not a scientific breakdown or sort of objective scientific method breakdown. It's just reactionary. So you have to let it digest and have to again let the relationship you had with it separate, not die, but just like kind of simmer and get to a very cool situation.
There are
And then
exceptions
yeah.
to that. Like I know Arcen wrote. I even looked up and I have it off to the side here. They wrote about AI War, the original AI War. I think 4 years out from its initial launch, and it was still going strong and all that stuff at the time. And you know, generally, like what you're saying is usually you want to be completely separated. But I don't see a problem, and maybe even year on year, maybe you want to do a few. Maybe you're like, you know what? I want to see what I feel like a year or 6 months down the road. Give it a little bit of
Yeah.
time, and then maybe come back to another couple of years or 5, 10 years down the line, see where you're
Yeah.
at.
I agree with that. I think that would be called like a milestoning, like kind of a post-mortem, like
Almost
you're
like
like,
a
well,
year in review that people do every year, something like that.
yep, totally makes sense. And I think with AI War, that game wasn't constantly in post-launch development, but rather the expansions were sort of picked up at certain points. They were worked on, they were completed, and then it was whether or not the team was ready to move on or if they wanted some time off, that kind of stuff. And during one of those periods of time off, I think that's when Chris Park put together that post-mortem, and it made sense, right? Because the game had been out, and I think the 3 expansions that were the major expansions that he saw for the game had been out as well. And then the game went on to do 4 more expansions. So
And they put
it
out
was
like 4 or 5 games at the time as well. In that time.
right. We were working on other games, but Chris Park is a pretty unique person. Like he still has biases. I'm not trying to strip him of those, but he is like he's very good at being like separated from his work even as he's doing it. He's very analytical, he's constantly self-analyzing, he's constantly writing things out in tomes. If you've ever seen his articles, his emails, his even just sort of having conversations with him, he writes a lot. So that sort of to me it indicates that he's one of those people that maybe can pull off some of that stuff in the midst of it. And and definitely people can, but it's not something that I think comes naturally to a lot of people. And it's a thing that I think Chris is self-aware, right? You have to be self-aware of what you're doing and who you are in the situation as you're writing it. And he always does that. He points out that I may not feel this way, in 6 months time or a year down the road based on kind of where I'm at then versus where I'm at now and where the project is at then versus now. So it's like he's aware of it. And that's really important, I think, when you make those, those proclamations, especially maybe right in the middle of it's spike in popularity, or like it's just not going the way you want it to in the initial that like bout. There can just be so much, like you said, emotions and other things running around in your head that don't give you the clarity that you're going to get later on.
And
oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, through post-mortems as well, it doesn't necessarily always have to be directly involved with game development. I mean, we've already touched on this. One of the ones I found fascinating that I had actually led many developers over the course of me doing what I do. They're like, oh, this is my first game, so on and so forth. I'm like, well, be careful. There's terrible people out there type situation. The developers of it was Wastelands Interactive. They created Worlds of Magic and Planar Conquest, which you guys probably never heard of, but it's okay. They were 4X games, but they released Worlds of Magic, and their postmortem they wrote up was, I think, entitled or not entitled, was titled or called "Get Every Game for Free on Steam," and here's how. And essentially, they were just like many developers and were and still are victims of just constant scammers, people posing as content creators, influencers, and so on and so forth, reaching out to them, getting codes, and then selling those codes. And they actually chose to be the main focal point of their post-mortem, which was interesting and kind of a good point or good resource for the industry as a whole. So
yeah, and you can and that I think some of the thoughts on that point you made, Bumpy, is that you don't have to postmortem anything so generally. Like you can postmortem anything specifically, like that came out of like an effort of a project, and you'll often get more out of. I mean, obviously, doing 7 different postmortems of different sections of your, it's probably not viable, but you can get different things if you look at specific areas that as opposed to just saying, okay, we're going to do like a general analysis of the entire, macro, design or development process. I think that's a really good point. TD, go ahead if you had something. I think I had something else there, but I'm kind of like forming my thought on that.
It was more of a general thought about, in some ways, we're seeing less like point by point postmortems, and with social media, you're seeing more developers sharing the process as they go, and you're getting real time updates. And here's a problem I'm dealing with now, and how I'm handling it, and watching them develop on Twitch. And there's so many different ways people are sharing that just the landscape has changed in a way that I just hadn't thought about when we first started talking about this.
I do wonder like how many developers go back and read their tweets from months ago and sort of, self-analyze and say, was that actually true? Or, what was I just kind of creating something in my head at the time for that, trying to believe that this was going to happen, that kind of stuff. It's interesting to think about. I'm guessing not a lot of devs do that, or because it's just not a normal, I think, exercise for people to do. But it would be one of those things that if you're like really not critical, but you want to make sure that you're critiquing and making sure that you're going about things the right way. Hopefully you're doing some of your tweeting in the post-mortem period that we talked about, right? As opposed to just always doing it as like a continuation of the process. Most likely you are. If you're tweeting all the time and stuff, then you're going to at some point be in that actual time where it makes sense to be, having that retrospective and really looking at what's happened. And maybe then you do that full breakdown. I see a lot of devs that will talk, like you said, incessantly all the time throughout the process. But at the end, when it's over and before they move on to the next project, they'll do like a full post or something like that. That is more of a full post-mortem breakdown. I have a few devs that I follow that definitely have that approach. It's just different now, right? It's not the same back then, where you just had that one article go up on a big game design site and everybody was just flocked to it that was interested in it. And even then, I don't think it was like that viral or that big of a thing. It was just insiders who wanted to learn about things, and of course, like people coming up that like wanted to have their first couple of releases go the way they wanted them to. The last point was on let's see, Kelly's point was the game industry changes over time. Yep, game design is forever. That was the one I wanted to do. Always go in postmortems, be prepared for some developer bias. We talked about that. I don't know what my last point was, but I know what it was. We talked about it pre-show. That's what I'm thinking of. I was like, I'll find it in your notes that we talked about in pre-show. That's why I'm floundering here. So the idea that postmortems can not only, like we were just saying with Bumpy, postmortems can't not only can do with like the macro, can do with like micro areas of the game design. Postmortems can be like applied to almost any area in life that has like or any career path or like job in life that has those major projects, major undertakings that are hard to get your brain wrapped around the full extent of them, especially as you're going through them, right? Like I think that's really important when you have those like kind of projects in any kind of form or fashion. Like at the end of them, to go back and have that retrospective is really important. I'm sure that they're called different things in different industries, but we all kind of collectively agreed there's not a lot of it going on outside of the video game industry that we know, or specifically publicly shared versions of it. We understand that there probably are internal discussions and write-ups and breakdowns and debriefings and all that kind of stuff. But we don't know about too much because it's not something that you see a lot in industries like film, television, books, reading, all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting thing that, because the industry, I feel like the indies and game development in general has come a long way because of its openness with a lot of this stuff. who knows how stunted the growth would be for games and its design if we didn't have such an open, general open approach. I think in our corner of the industry, if not in the industry in general. So it is something that I think is cool, but it's also like, why hasn't it taken over in other areas? And
I think it
it's
has. We
probably
just don't know where to look because I know people that do like VFX breakdowns and things of that nature. They always have back, what are they called? Like the breakdowns of how those things actually happened. So, like they're going to do their own VFX stuff, and then they have the breakdown how the shot was done, what system they used. So I think it's there in probably most
specialists,
industries.
like,
We
right,
just don't know
yeah,
where to look to find it. So
specialist sites, specialist people, right? So, kind of like doing that kind of stuff, like you said, the SFX. I'm thinking more general, like, macro breakdowns of the entire project and stuff. We just like that's a rarer thing, but I agree that you see those technical breakdowns, especially from engineers, technicians, designers, a lot more. And they're just like, you have to go find them, like you said, Bumpy. It's not like they're just going to pop up in front of you if you're not interested in or following that culture, subculture, that topic, etc. Then it's not like it's going to just be flashing in front of us. That's a good point. We have a bias towards a lot of that stuff because I'm sure if we were in those industries, there would be those resources to some extent that we've talked about, like we in our industry. It's
I
a good point.
imagine people who aren't in the game industry probably, I mean, there's, obviously like bigger journalists and stuff, and they oftentimes will get a hold of these articles and then repost them, or they're the ones doing the interviews, and, so it's a little bit easier in that sense. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we're going to find that, your normal Joe Schmo isn't going to be able to walk down the street and be like, let me break out my phone and look up, Post-Mortem, they're not going to be able to find it as easy. Like I couldn't
Yeah, I
find the
mean,
article I wanted to find today.
yeah,
Searching for it,
but
I had
that
to actually go back into my own emails, dig around, and then find that I had the link on a video that I made. I was like, okay.
Yeah, because I mean, like, I googled the general stuff, but if you're looking for a specific thing, sometimes it's really hard to find it.
Yep.
And I definitely think that it's definitely a thing where if for when I was growing or when I was kind of growing up in the industry in my mid-20s, it was like it was just the cool thing to do was to learn.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was like, oh, everybody was like, everybody's learning and you're not learning. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you're not reading these postmortems, you're crazy. But again, how limited how, to what extent was my space, limited? It was an echo chamber to some extent, right? And like there wasn't millions and millions and millions of us, but it was definitely a group of us, like, a lot of people that was sort of the subculture at the time. It was like, if you're not learning, you're not going to be able to implement what you need to make a good commercial release. And so it was like very common thing to be like, hey, did you read it? Like it's almost like always happening. It even happens now in chats, but it happens less so because we don't see as many postmortems. But it's always like sharing, hey, did you see this? In like a group chat or with your studio. Hey, did you see this? Because it's got some interesting stuff, and you're not required to read it, but it would be really good if you did. Like, it would make sense to go over it. If you don't want to read it, let me just give you the summary or the points, the important points. So those are conversations that are happening all the time. And it's whether or not you're in it, as you point out. If you're not involved in it, then it's not going to be something that comes across your radar, so to speak. But if it's something that you're really looking to learn and pick up on, whatever it is, you're likely going to find those resources from your digging to look for that knowledge.
Yep, that's very true. I know I found a lot of stuff just from people I follow on Twitter. It's like hey, we released our game a while back, and here's our thoughts on it. It's like, it's essentially kind of a video game version of lessons learned from whatever, right? Stuff that we do from the game industry, but that's more specifically toward their game or a specific point in the development or reaching out to people or whatever the case is. So yeah.
As we're wrapping up, I just want to like maybe mention a little bit of like concern about documentation because social media is just harder to search, I think, up. Like when you've seen something like you've had a really nice thread or something like that. This happens all the time with me, by the way. And it's not like documentation of game developer. It's like, what was that super funny post? And I cannot find it. And it just kills me because I'm like, because it's a picture a lot of times, and you try to search a picture, the picture's like, I don't have search terms. That's like, I don't know your terms. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have the words like, actually embedded in the tweet. It's in the picture. So I'm like, why can't, I don't know, something hilarious come up? Yeah. It just sucks because I feel like there's sometimes I'm like, oh, and at times it's not just funny stuff. It's like, oh yeah, there was that really, really important thread and you just can't find it, or you can't remember who wrote it. Or if you do remember who wrote it, you have to go through, you have to just just go through their their timeline, and you're like, God, they tweet a lot. Like, this was like only like a week ago, and I cannot find it. Like, that kind of stuff happens a lot.
That thing I was looking for last week for Songs of Conquest, that took me like 20 minutes digging through to find.
I kind of wish Google would have found a way to integrate with some of these like popular websites a little bit, or social websites a little bit more. I understand it's like a huge undertaking. It wouldn't be something that would just like yeah, that's all you need is just Google to do it. But it's like, why can't I Google search Twitter? I can Google search some other things like that are specific sites.
You get Twitter searches through Google. I mean, I have. If you put something in, it will say, "Oh, Twitter's."
It's true. But they do pop up. They do pop up. But it would be almost interesting if they had like a specific, like Twitter, Google, yeah. What do you call it? Like a widget or an add-on for, or I can't remember whatever the add-ons are for the browser. Where you're like, maybe. I just want to plug in. Yeah, I just want to search for I want this, because you can do that, I think, too, in Google with a certain perspective. But anyway, it doesn't feel like they come out that much sometimes, like when you're looking for certain things. So there is some concern about documentation. Like, I hope we still, I mean, there's a concern about historical documentation of video games in general, right? Like, a lot of these platforms, like when they are done, they don't necessarily do the historical cleaning up that you would hope, and kind of preserve certain games. Like, so there are organizations out there that are trying to combat this. Like, there's certain games that, like, they're like, effectively, this game doesn't exist if we didn't have this one file. Like, and we're trying to upload it so that we can have a digital file, and then that can be shared, and it can sort of be preserved in that way and stuff. But of course, there's copyright stuff as well, trademark things that come into play. So it's very interesting.
Source code is missing for a lot of things. I remember Heroes of Might and Magic 3, they had the source code for the main game, but they didn't have it for the expansions, which is weird.
Right.
And they're like, well, we can't do anything about it. Sorry. Really?
It's your games or like your favorite games preservation may be resting on some random dude who has that file in his pocket and just had a falling out with the rest of the studio or something like that. Project Zomboid, this was...
You would think you could reverse engineer that, but apparently not.
Yeah, I think it's the want to, obviously, as well, that comes into play there. Like, but you're right. You probably could on certain occasions. But the one thing that sticks out to me is in game design and game development, like, you're always supposed to back up your files. Like, when you're doing whatever you're doing, you're supposed to have some sort of digital repository that you're saving all the time, that you're like saving like constantly, and you can revert back if you have a mistake, or if you have an error, or there's a bug or something, you can revert back to the previous state. And then you also make hard copies of all those all your files, essentially, and keep them separate from your main desktop, so to speak, or whatever is like holding all of that stuff, because things can happen. And that did happen to Project Zomboid once, like, I think a decade ago now, is that they basically had their entire code either stolen or wiped. I can't even remember the exact situation, but you could totally Google it, like Project Zomboid lost their code or something like that, and it'll come up and it'll tell you how they, it was that critical cardinal sin of not backing up your game files, and it just being on one thing, and that one thing can easily break, disappear, all that kind of stuff. So that is like, that's like sort of the thought. And with game design 101, make sure that you have their backups. But it also ties into, certain games were designed in really finicky, not optimal ways. And again, you might just have some random dude with the only copy of certain parts of the code or game, or like that kind of stuff. And it's just sort of up to the whims of them whether or not they get that stuff together, and you ever see those kind of stuff, those games again. And this can date back to like games from like the 80s. And it does. Like there's a lot of historians in the game industry. Not a lot, but like there's a few like that are really like focused on trying to locate these games and seeing actually if they still exist or if they've actually effectively gotten extinct. Like there's some games that are just lost to time at this point. Like the names are known, like descriptions exist, but the actual like playable game is gone. So that might be an interesting topic at another time or a subtopic, maybe not a full hour, but video game history and how people are trying to preserve it even in the face of like trademarks and big corporations who are like don't care at all.
That's the original idea and thought behind emulators and emulated games.
Right.
It wasn't for pirates, which is exactly what it ended up being for, but it was more to, document and kind of, what's the word? It's like file, stockpile, whatever the word is, into enter into like a library of all this stuff, all these games that have come from days past, and ways to like even view and play them. I assume, ideally, conceptually, that it was always about when the copyrights are gone and all that stuff, you guys can still go back and spend your time playing and enjoying these games if you wanted. But of course, that just meant that people are now constantly rushing 100 miles an hour ahead, trying to emulate everything and get everything for free. So.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, obviously, that's the bad apples ruining the bushel, so to speak, in that case. But like, I feel like I also like emulators because, like, say I own Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, but it's really so I don't feel like I'm pirating it by grabbing the emulator version and getting to play around with certain tools that you just cannot get to play with on the Super Nintendo version, because the emulator offers and you don't need
to have the old CRT monitors or any working console at that point, because those are starting to die.
Right, but it's also just a bevy of options. I get to like speed through this part that I don't want to watch or things like that. Like you just get these little accessibility options that the original game can't provide that emulators can. So emulators in general, history of video games, maybe a topic at some point that could be fun. So we are just at our hour mark. Do we want to wrap up? Was there any other thoughts or musings on the topic of Post-Mortem before we head out?
I think we covered a little bit of everything.
Do you want to go through Missy's stuff there?
Well, she's got a lot since I posted my last link. So I'm going to post this link because that was that I should have posted that in the first 5 minutes when Missy asked, how do you go about how do you make those in real life? That bottom link I just posted right there, I think, is a nice place to start, just to get that background, that bedrock of what a postmortem is, supposedly supposed to be. Again, it doesn't have to be anything specific. Like I mean, there's just things you can follow, guidelines. So at my work, we do it a little bit after big board game fairs. We should maybe do it more in depth. Oh yeah. Isn't it the case that if you add Twitter between quotations that it is a necessary word? I think that you can do that. Yeah. Again, I think it's more about it just lets you down overall is what I was kind of getting at. I know you can kind of manipulate to get that search from Twitter via Google, but it's just not that good of a search in the end. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of the posts on Twitter and like Instagram aren't even text. A lot of them are images. So it's very hard to like get the right like search terms a lot of times because maybe those images haven't been crawled on by like Google's bots as much as the ones that are just generally submitted onto the net. Reverse engineer should be an option. Thinking back about the drama in a Fallout with a dev and publisher, and then the publisher got the game files through an illegal download, and then changed the logos in the startup screen and sold their version on Steam. The Seeking City is what it's called. Interesting, Seeking City. I mean, there's got to be examples of that happening a lot. Like, I understand, and I mean, whether that was a positive, negative, or neutral situation. I know that there's been some positive situations where games have more or less been lost, but they've said, no, there's someone who just refuses to take that as an answer, and they find a way to reverse engineer certain things, get things in a place. Obviously the with the original developer or IP owner's blessing. That I've seen that happen multiple times where they're like, I don't know, I don't think it's salvageable, but if you want to give it a try, you can. I swear people hit up Arcen all the time for that kind of thing too. Like, let me get in the code of a Valor without win. Let me get in the thing, this kind of stuff, and play around with it. And Chris is generally open to that kind of stuff. It's kind of interesting. The sinking city. Gotcha. Makes sense. Yeah. So it's yeah. I mean, there's the general things that happen like that, like like the high percentage stuff. But then there's a lot of like things out there like that. That happen despite themselves, like the reverse engineering of situation of like games that you're like or lost games that you think they'll never get a chance to get out again because they just didn't make sense. Like on the like when you talk about like old PC games, like they're not going to run on Windows 11. Like they have to, like somebody has to go in there and actually like get that game up and running on Windows 11 through specific code additions,
Yep.
plugins, all that kind of stuff. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
I remember those days. That's why Good Old Games or GOG.com was always fantastic.
Right.
Because they did I guess they did the work themselves, and then they got everything running, and they were able to sell it. And it was great.
And they asked developers to say that they're okay with a DRM free release.
Yep.
And that was and so that was an important aspect of that, because that reminded you of the good old days where, like you said, you didn't have any specific Steam list or anything like that. It was just you have a file on your computer and you open it and you play the game. And that clicked with a lot of people earlier on. Obviously, they've had to evolve their strategies a little bit, but they haven't completely gotten rid of that. That's still their bedrock, and really how they differentiate from Steam. Unlike a lot of other developers or a lot of other PC stores and platforms. Yep.
All right. Well, I suppose that will do it for today. Now, next week we're trying the different thing, Tiny Disaster?
Whatever the schedule is that I put in there.
I am digging through and I can't find my window. Hold
on. No,
Raise
next week is tutorials.
Oh, it's tutorials. Okay. So it's a week
and then Game Club.
Okay.
But if we want to talk about Game Club and announce
first rule of Game Club, no, is not talking about it, because that would be a very weird silent episode. Essentially, we're going to, I don't say challenge, but suggest an indie game that each of us have enjoyed to the others, and I suppose you guys are going to give it a chance to play it and then share your thoughts on it, and we're basically just kind of talk about the game. It was like a book club. We all played the game, and then we're going to talk about it. Now, granted, the one I chose from like 400 years ago. No, I think I played it in 2014, but it stuck with me, and I really enjoyed it.
I've heard of it. I've never played it. Now, is it an Elysian Tale or an Elysian Tale?
Just an Elysian. Right now, I can't say it. You should never said a word. Elysian Tale. I think that's how
Elysian. Yes. Yeah. That's. I was gonna say I was right 33% on what my guesses were, so that was good.
An Elysian Tale does have voice acting. I love Fidget; she's amazing. She's adorable. And the line I remember, she's like, "Mash the buttons." That just, I don't know, makes me smile every time I think about it. And A Tiny Disaster had the idea that, especially now that we have the Steam summer sale that's kicked off right now and it's going, I don't know how much longer it's going, maybe another week or something along those lines, but if anybody wanted to grab the game on cheap, on discount, and they were able to, they could also dive in, play the game, and enjoy. Now, that being said, do you two have an idea what games you wanted? So we could give the list out for anyone who wanted to do this. Again, no obligation to do so. Just if something you wanted to also experience the game and then share your thoughts, you could join in on it.
I'm still thinking about mine, but I will have it by next Wednesday, when I know the Steam sale will still have at least a day or two left. So we can, I think next Wednesday, at the latest, we need to share all those games, so that Missy even points out, will you announce it beforehand so viewers can maybe have a try? And yeah, we'll definitely endeavor to do that. So Bumpy's has already been shared.
I know. I'm sorry to put you guys on the spot.
No, you're totally fine. It's not a big deal. It's a good point. Like, it's a good point to try to get these out before the sale ends. And I think the sale ends. It's a 2-week sale. It started on Thursday, so 7th. I believe it will. Okay, is that Thursday or Wednesday?
Thursday. So 1 p.m.
So we'll have
Eastern Thursday.
So we'll have that full day on once we finish once we do our thing. We'll have, viewers will have up to, I think, maybe 18 hours or so. It's not a ton of time, I know, but it should be enough. If they were live watching, Missy should be in a good situation. If we can't, or if we just If there's another way we have to go about it, we might share it on socials. But that I don't know. Like, it's probably a thing that will most likely. I don't know. We might still share on socials based on what Tiny Disaster feels.
I'll do
like,
both.
So.
Yeah.
Okay.
King Isaac Klinkster
Cool.
even reviewed and liked the game too. So there you go. It's two of us that like that game.
Nice. So we'll have some. Is it based on games you just enjoyed, or maybe there are other reasons? I mean, it's just really we want other people to play them and get their thoughts on it, because it's one of our favorites. I think is a good way to go about it.
Yeah,
I think it's.
But it gives us a good chance to do a deeper discussion into a game of why it worked or how it hooked people. Like I've been back and forth on like there's some that I've considered picking that I haven't played yet, but have like been at the top of my list kind of thing. So I don't know. Or I might pick one that Missy has recommended to me. So we'll see.
That's an interesting idea. Putting one out there and then saying I have to play it too now. I like that.
Yeah, and that's another thing, Missy. Yeah, you can come back next week as well. Give us your best shout, and we'll see see if that's something we want to check out.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Right,
I mean,
so,
obviously
go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's great, and obviously that helps to have viewer input, giving us more fodder for our shows and our episodes and such. Sorry about that, Bumpy.
Oh, no worries. All right, so I was gonna say that's basically the show in a nutshell. So if you guys want to hear all about tutorials, we're gonna try to do something. Wait, there's two serial cleaners, serial cleaner and serial cleaners with an S. I'm guessing it's the second one. Anyway, oh, it's not out yet, so maybe it's serial cleaner without the S. Anyway, we'll be back next week with that fun, wonderful stuff. We kind of touched on that 2 weeks ago, and we'll return. Well, maybe it was last week. I don't know. We'll return next week with more tutorial stuff, things that work, things that we like, things that made an impact, different ways we can do it, and so on and so forth. So that's it from us. We'll see you guys next week. Take care. Bye.